Welcome to the ISTS Talk series, in which we will present you hackers. Hackers who have accomplished significant things, changed the world, and generally agreed to come and share their experience here with us. Speaking of changing the world, it is my great pleasure to introduce Katie Moussouris, who actually did kind of change the world. She was the designer of the Bugs Bounty program at Microsoft, and that program indeed was a world-changing event. It was the first time that an organization the size and gravitas of Microsoft started a bug bounty program. That opened the way for many others who were unsure of the concept. And this changed the way that exploit developers interacted with industry, essentially. In the situation when vulnerabilities have become more and more laborious to analyze, developers needed to be paid for their time somehow because they need to eat. On the other hand, the full disclosure movement, that full disclosure standard did not quite provide it to them. It turned out that there was a middle ground, and Katie essentially discovered it like Columbus. Right?
As in others had come before me, and then I actually, made it a bigger thing. Yes, exactly like Columbus, like that.
With that, I'm turning it over to Katie.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you all for joining me. Can you all hear me okay? If not, trust me, I could be louder. Oh my God, there's chalk. That's great. Of course. So first things first, how many of you have ever written a line of code in your life? Excellent. How many of you are human? Good. Okay, so you've all written bugs. That's good to know. This is something that is fundamental to the understanding of large and small organizations, is that as long as code is written by humans and we are flawed, we will write code with flaws in it. So one of the inevitabilities is dealing with those security flaws when they inevitably are written by humans such as yourself, and they are found by other humans. So we're actually going to talk about a vulnerability coordination maturity model, which sounds about as exciting as a presenter dressed in all black. But hopefully I will be able to spice it up as a presenter dressed in all black with purple hair can do for you. When we talk about it in terms of the lens of the Internet of Things, so that's essentially the increasing connectivity of everyday devices to the internet, and often by organizations that did not consider themselves software developers, and some organizations did not consider themselves actually employing humans at all. But organizations like car manufacturers, Barbie doll toy makers, things like sneaker manufacturers, and things like that. So we've got all kinds of these devices that are joining the internet that we know today, which we also know the internet to be very, very insecure today. And we've got a major tipping point or a turning point where we've got so many more devices and so many more organizations coming on board, and they have no idea how to handle security vulnerabilities. So one of the things that, by the way, that's my Twitter handle. That is a 0, and it's pronounced Katie Mo, not Kate Emo. It's not how it's pronounced, and I get told that all the time. It's like saying, oh, I totally thought that's what you meant, because look at your Twitter cloud of all the things that you tweet about. I tweet about hackers and karaoke pretty much all the time, occasionally export controls and bug bounties. But who am I? Sergey gave me a very, very generous introduction. Essentially, I'm the mother of Microsoft's bug bounty programs, where Microsoft had publicly sworn just years before that, in fact, they would never pay security researchers or hackers money for bugs or money for vulnerabilities. And why did they say that? Well, they were getting over 200,000 non-spam email messages a year into Secure at Microsoft, of all of these altruistic hackers trying to actually make Microsoft software more secure for all of us. And they were getting this for free. So why would they ever decide to increase that volume, for one, or potentially mess with the signal-to-noise ratio that they were already getting? And one of the things that I had to do was convince them that there are better ways to interact with the hacker community, and using incentives and structured incentive programs, bug bounty programs, and, for example, the $100,000 mitigation bypass bounty program that is still running and is still the largest ongoing defensive bounty that's not associated with a single contest. It is ongoing. That there was a better way to acquire security vulnerability information in a timely way, and also acquire that information ahead of potential adversaries. So that mitigation bypass bounty, for example, for $100,000 per, is for something that is not an individual bug. It is not a bug bounty. It is basically a technique bounty. So it is looking for new attack techniques that can bypass all the latest mitigations in the latest version of the platform. Attackers don't need to buy such things because they have existing mitigation bypasses that work. How many of you have heard of return-oriented programming, or ROP? Right, that's an exploitation technique that currently bypasses a lot of mitigations on standard platforms. So bad guys don't necessarily need new attack techniques. They've got some that work. Whereas the defense side absolutely needed to get as much of a head start as possible in learning about these new techniques, because those are the things that require architectural level changes down the road. So doing the bug bounties for Microsoft really enabled me to see what an organization of that size would have to deal with in terms of figuring out how to structure their bounty programs, what to bounty, what makes the most sense for them when they're getting all of these bugs for free, and essentially working with the hacker community in ways that are mutually beneficial. There's ISO standards editor on this list of things that I've subjected myself to in my career. That was an accidental thing that when I worked at Microsoft, because I had written Symantec's vulnerability disclosure policy in my previous job, Microsoft said, ISO is proposing an international standard on responsible disclosure. Go find out what that is and please stop it. And so a decade later, I'm an editor of this ISO standard. So I've been working on that with a number of people for a very long time, and now it's called vulnerability disclosure because, number one, the word responsible is super loaded. But really, it's a process that organizations should follow in order to handle incoming vulnerability reports and communicate with the outside. But something in this process of dealing with vulnerabilities, both as a finder of vulnerabilities, a coordinator of vulnerabilities amongst multiple parties, and working at some of the biggest vendors in the world, and also working at one point in time as a Linux developer and developing vulnerability response programs for a Linux operating system company as an individual person who cared about security. Looking at all of these different areas, it became clear that it wasn't just an ISO standard that was needed to guide organizations into figuring out how to deal with incoming vulnerability reports. It was actually a roadmap and a way to assess their current capabilities across 5 different areas and have them actually get better at the process of handling incoming vuln reports. So that's what we're going to talk about today. The other stuff that I do, I can talk with you about later, afterwards. I do some economic modeling as part of a MIT Sloan visiting scholar work, economic modeling of the vulnerability economy and exploit market. We had some interesting chats today about that. Harvard Belfer affiliate, I work on some cybersecurity policy, cyber statecraft type of stuff. So, the model itself. How many of you are familiar with maturity models in general? If not, that's okay. Okay, one of you. So yes, the business school guy. All right, so maturity models in software, you see them presented in things like Microsoft's security development lifecycle, where they outline all of the different steps that one should take in order to minimize, reduce, and eliminate as many vulnerabilities as possible while you're building the code. So there's a maturity model that sort of Microsoft adopts. There's another one from Cigital called the BSIM, Building Security in Maturity Model. And those are a list of activities and capabilities that mature organizations perform in order to build more secure software. So that's kind of on the building end. And then you've got, on the incident response end, when a breach occurs, you have maturity models there that look at what are the capabilities when I'm attacked. How do I detect, contain, recover, et cetera, all of these types of things. So you've got before the software is released maturity model, you've got after you've been breached maturity model, but there was this lacking space in the maturity model for how do you handle incoming vulnerability reports, ideally from a friendly security researcher / hacker, and how do you handle that gracefully? And it's more than just engineering. So release this vulnerability coordination maturity model. And it's, I don't know if you can see this little spider web up there, but it's essentially 5 different capability areas, including engineering and analytics, but there are some other really important ones organizationally with your analytics to improve the process, and then also finally incentives. Bug bounties fall under that auspice. But for each maturity, for each capability area, there's 3 maturity levels, basically basic, advanced, or expert. And ideally, when an organization gets to expert in any of these capability areas, what you're looking at is an organization that has turned a mistake, a flaw, a vulnerability, into a learning experience to build more secure code in the future. So organizationally, I mean, you have to have, at a basic level, executive support. Somebody has to tell you, we care about vulnerabilities in our software. We're going to respond to incoming vulnerability reports, and these could come from hackers, but they could also come from your users, your partners, depending on if you are part of a complex supply chain, like a mobile device. You may have, up and down your supply chain, a whole bunch of partners and constituents that you will have to coordinate with when a vulnerability becomes apparent to any one of you in the stack. At the advanced level, you've got a policy and a process to deal with it. So I mentioned those ISO standards. ISO 29147 is vulnerability disclosure, and ISO 30111 is vulnerability handling processes. The reason why they're split is because vuln disclosure takes place when somebody from the outside of your organization reports a vulnerability in, and you need to process it somehow. That happens in ISO 30111. And then ISO 29147 takes over again when you're ready to communicate out to your constituents, your supply chain, your users, your customers, whoever they may be, potentially to the public, to the media. At the expert level, you've got all of this. You've got executive support, processes, and a dedicated budget. So one of the things that I like to highlight with this is that I, as an individual Linux developer, was able to get to the advanced level just on my own. The only thing we didn't have was me just wearing exclusively a security hat. I was having to fix the systems administration tools that were part of our Linux distro, and then I was also running the vulnerability coordination program at the same time. So even an individual developer can achieve significant levels of maturity in this model. Okay, so engineering. This is the part that you guys are probably most in tune with. At the basic level, having a clear way to receive vuln reports and some way to actually track them as security bug tracking. So when we talk about the difference between basic and advanced, when you are actually documenting your security decisions and deferrals are things like where you're writing a piece of code that may or may not get reused down the line, you don't know. Perhaps you're not doing some bounds checking or integrity checking of the input coming in. WebGL is a great example of this, where some graphics library code that was intended to only really talk and receive trusted input was suddenly opened up to the web. So in the advanced stage of engineering, you would actually have documentation of some of your decisions, deferrals, and your security trade-offs that you made, such as, I'm expecting this to be completely trusted code, please don't put it straight on the web. At the expert level, this is again where I was saying that you would be able to turn these weaknesses into something where you can learn from it, and you're learning your vulnerability trends, you're doing your root cause analysis, and you're actually feeding them back into your security development lifecycle so that you can stop making the same mistakes over and over again, ideally. There's another ISO standard that's listed there, 27034. I'm also an editor for that one, and that is writing more secure code, essentially. So communications. This is not just about communicating with the outside world, with a hacker who potentially lets you know about security vulnerabilities. This is also about internal communications, tailored and repeatable communications. I don't know if any of you use any Microsoft products. I see a lot of Apples out there. But have you heard of Patch Tuesday, right? Second Tuesday of the month, or as some people call it, Black Tuesday. But that is the monthly admission by Microsoft that its software is written by humans. And there's a very specific pattern to the way that they talk about vulnerabilities. It is tailored and repeatable communication where it's very consistent, such that the consumers of that information, typically a systems administrator is going to be reading that. They understand exactly what the severity is, what the impact is. They don't necessarily need a numerical score because they understand the lingua franca that has been developed by Microsoft over the years to consistently communicate about that. Now, they'll obviously need a different form of communication that's more technical for the security researcher or the hacker who reported the vulnerability in the first place. So being able to figure out what those communication statements are and being able to repeat them is advanced. Now, the expert level is really interesting. The expert level is something where you are actually taking your communication to the point where you are sharing information with a set of partners who can help you protect your constituency. An example of this that a lot of you probably haven't heard of is something called the Microsoft Active Protections Program. This was a unique program at the time, and now more organizations are doing it. And that's where Microsoft would actually send detailed technical bug information ahead of Patch Tuesday to a whole bunch of antivirus, IDS, IPS partners, so that those partners could create protection signatures. And that way, when the patches were live, they call it Patch Tuesday Exploit Wednesday. It was more like Patch Tuesday Exploit Tuesday afternoon, where those patches are getting reverse engineered by attackers. The underlying vulnerability is found, and attackers are writing exploits and trying to attack people who haven't applied the patches yet within hours. And so what this does is that information sharing, that level of proactive communication enables the company to essentially protect in partnership of over 100 different organizations such that the protections roll out at the same time the patches roll out. So it reduces that window of exposure that much more. When I was talking about this model to the Food and Drug Administration, I was saying that, probably a lot of your medical device manufacturing companies, your little 8-person dev shops, are probably not going to be able to get to that expert level, and that's okay. And they said, no, actually they might. They might be able to, because they might be able to do a lot of the beaconing back of the information. They can actually look for signs of exploitation in the wild, and they could send out potentially alerts to their constituents to be able to deal with vulnerability response in more real time. So that's just something they need to be told to do and told to incorporate in their processes, thinking ahead of the capability areas that they need to cover to handle vulnerability reports. Okay, so analytics. How are you going to use your data and trends to improve your processes? So obviously at the basic level, you want the number and severity of vulnerabilities that are being found and exploited in your code to go down over time. So basic tracking there. Advanced, you're actually looking at root cause analysis. So some things in the security development lifecycle, like banning unsafe functions. If you're coding in C, banning stir copy, et cetera. Using your compiler tools to essentially block, the checking in of code that is using some of these banned functions, depending on your development environment. But using this root cause analysis to feed back into your software development lifecycle such that you're not, again, making the same mistakes, and you're trying to ideally eliminate the possibility that future coders in your organization are going to continue to make those mistakes. So again, expert level in analytics is interesting. So how many of you have ever seen Microsoft issue what's called an out-of-band patch, right? Something's on fire, and the patch comes out as an emergency patch. It doesn't come out on Patch Tuesday. And what that actually is Microsoft has telemetry. They have data feeding back from all of the systems around the world. Again, this was one that I thought small medical device manufacturers might not be able to do. But in fact, they can if they just start looking for the data. So essentially tracking crash data, crash is an indication of, obviously, a software bug. That bug could be exploitable. That could be a failed exploitation attempt. That is the kind of data that Microsoft would use in real time from either themselves, their own sensors, if you've ever seen the little Dr. Watson pop up and say, do you want to send this back to Microsoft? And other platforms have similar error reporting, right? Google does as well. That is the telemetry going back to the mothership, indicating that there's a problem. So what Microsoft would look for in terms of its decision making is for sort of a hockey stick of exploitation that's happening in the wild, and they would use that to make a decision. Yes?
What would be the cost of that kind of infrastructure to actually catch those kinds of reports?
Well, if an organization is just building up their capabilities, so let's say it's a fitness tracker and it's sending data back, to the mothership, I'm assuming that, they can, with that very narrow product line, they could build in those capabilities fairly easily before they're an 800 product line supported giant company like Microsoft. And honestly, if Microsoft could do it at their great size, it makes sense that organizations that are much smaller, if they know what to look for and know that they should be tracking this and know that it can actually be turned into an information asset and be useful to them, that they might start doing it. Especially for medical devices, the FDA has just released some post-market guidance for medical devices, released to the public, and part of that is that they follow the ISO standards they're recommending, and that they also follow this maturity model to be able to assess where they are right now in capabilities and get better. And so ideally, they're going to be held accountable to, do you actually have a way to handle vulnerability reports, and then are you actually improving over time? So ideally, when you're small, it shouldn't cost that much. When you're larger, it'll cost more. But building it in as soon as you know you need this data is where we're trying to get.
Can you tell us what it costs Microsoft?
So that was built at a time when the Microsoft deployments were a lot less than they are today. So that was basically built in the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s. I joined Microsoft in April of 2007. So the telemetry in Dr. Watson was already there, and the crash buckets were already there. I will say that the person who masterminded this, Mr. John Lambert, is now a partner at Microsoft. So that goes to show that security does definitely pay off when you are dedicated and as dedicated as he is to real-time defense technology, and actually at the scale of Microsoft. So I'm guessing millions and millions of dollars is what it cost. But certainly it would have cost more today. Okay, so getting into incentives, and I will wrap in just a few minutes so we have time for questions. So incentives, the ability to encourage hackers to come forward. How many of you have heard of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act? Yep, and the Digital Millennium Copyrights Act. Okay, so these are laws in the United States that they are basically the criminalization of a lot of hacking. And the CFAA was passed in 1984 after the movie War Games scared the bejesus out of President Ronald Reagan. He said, "Don't we have a law for that?" And lawmakers said, "Not yet, sir." And they got on it. So he literally was scared by a movie into writing one of the first anti-hacking laws. And it was written broadly at the time on purpose. It has caused us many problems and much chagrin. And it has actually chilled security research, especially as we've moved into online services. So, a lot of it is around authorization and unauthorized access for computers that you do not control. So, hello, cloud services, online services, anything like that. So, one of the things that when I got to Microsoft was one of the first things that we did was we were the first major software vendor to say, if you report an issue in our online services and give us a chance to fix it, we won't pursue legal action against you. Now, that doesn't protect a hacker from potential criminal prosecution under federal law, because it's still a crime, but it does provide that reassurance that the civil prosecution from Microsoft, the quote-unquote victim of this hacking, to point out the flaws, to tell them about it, that the victim would actually show gratitude instead of malice back. So it's essentially skipping forward in the 5 stages of vulnerability response grief and going from that anger phase, getting to the acceptance phase and understanding that you're going to receive these reports and you should probably welcome them in. So the very first basic capability is show thanks, give a little swag, maybe some t-shirts or whatever, but clearly state that you will not pursue legal action against a hacker who is coming forward and reporting a bug to you. The way that I frame this for legislators and regulators in my policy work that I do is that we do not live in the world of Austin Powers, where Dr. Evil is going to outline his illicit plans to rob you and put you in the tank with the sharks with the lasers. That's not actually going to happen, you know. So what really happens is when a hacker actually does come forward and tries to tell you about something, they're taking a great risk, a great personal risk to themselves. And the least you can do is show a little appreciation and promise that you won't be collecting evidence when you're asking for proof of concept code. So at the advanced stage is when we get into bug bounties or financial rewards. And obviously, you know, I've taken you through this journey of all of these different capability areas, much more than just bug comes in and you fix it. This is much more, you know, in terms of thinking about maturity levels across all of these capabilities. When you are ready is when you can offer cash rewards. It would be a disaster for an organization that hadn't figured out how it's going to handle incoming bug reports at all to suddenly start saying, Toro, here's some money. It's probably a bad idea. Or as my friend said, one does not just walk into bug bounties, right? At the expert level, this is where you are understanding what your adversaries are doing with those bugs, how your bugs may or may not be traded on other markets. I call these the defense market and the offense market. There is a mixed use market in between there somewhere. A lot of people call it white market and black market, but black market implies illegal. It's not illegal. And actually, I don't think it should be for various reasons. But understanding that adversary behavior, understanding the vulnerability markets for your bugs is key to getting to the expert level. So I mentioned that $100,000 bounty for mitigation bypass and why adversaries don't need those new advanced mitigation bypass techniques. They already have ones that work. That is where you're understanding the market. You're not needing to deal with an outbidding situation. Similarly, the first IE bug bounty, which was a true bug bounty, one bug, one payout, was designed to actually do some traffic shaping, because you were getting all these bug reports for free from all these altruistic hackers who were reporting them for free and hoping for 12-point Arial font in a bulletin. That was their incentive. Well, we noticed a pattern. They weren't reporting anything during the beta period. Kind of the time in the life cycle of writing code that you want those bugs to come in. But they were holding because the only incentive would happen after that code was released to manufacturing. So we had created these little altruistic monsters, right? And so we had a giant spike. So this was a traffic shaping exercise where we understood nobody else is going to be buying our bugs in beta. These offense market players, why would they blow potentially $100,000 or more on an individual bug that could evaporate during the beta period? They would never do such a thing. So the only game in town was Microsoft at the beginning of the beta period. And so we did. We moved the spike, offering only up to $11,000 per bug. That was a maximum payment. Only paid out $10,000 once, for a grand total of 18 critical or important class vulnerabilities. Anyone want to guess the grand total? I told you there was a 10 grand payout, but everything else was less. Guess, guess, guess. You've all fallen asleep. That's okay. We can karaoke right after this. So the grand total was around $27,000 for 18 bulletin class vulnerabilities, all shuffled into the first 30 days of the IE11 beta period. So that is what I'm talking about when I talk about advanced expert incentives. When you talk about understanding your markets, understanding, yes, Sergey's going to ask me a question, but understanding what your adversaries are doing when they're trading and what's advantageous to you, even if you are already receiving those bugs. It's a timing issue. Yes, Sergey.
What exactly is the multiplication factor of the cost of patching something that has been released
Oh, God.
Beta. So what's your multiplier here?
So cost to the company itself is one thing, but cost to the organizations that have already deployed that software can go astronomical. So cost to the company itself, there were some very old numbers. Now they're very, very old numbers, but there were some old numbers that were run by an internal audit team, and it estimated that for each individual vulnerability that, multiple vulnerabilities were patched in a single bulletin, each individual one would cost the company roughly on average $100,000 each. If you were to publish a bulletin at all, just that publication process and all the testing that goes into it, average about $1 million. And this was before the Heartbleed kind of, vulnerability coordinations, the very expensive ones. There was a process that it's still called this in Microsoft called the Software Security Incident Response Protocol, or SIRP. And SIRP was like a noun and a verb and an adjective and a curse word. And SERPA clause would come in December and bring you lumps of coal, and terrible things would happen. But the cost of a SIRP, which is one of those emergency situations, was on average at the time, and these are almost a decade-old audit numbers, were close to $7 million per SIRP. So one of those out-of-band, hockey stick, exploitation, things happening, you're needing to coordinate with media, customers, engineers across the globe. I've seen SIRPs with thousands of people involved. Those were definitely above the average cost of a SIRP. But essentially, the company's costs are just one dimension. Then you just multiply that out. Certain customers of Microsoft's enlightened me because they said things like, can you please move to quarterly updates, because you know what, it costs me $1 million 12 times a year. Can you make that $1 million 4 times a year for me? That would be great. Can you do that? And we were like, probably not. Bad idea, my friends, but they were looking at controlling their costs. So you just multiply that out by by all of the enterprises that use those products. And similar numbers and similar multipliers are out there for any kind of very well permeated software, right? Okay, so I think, well, I finished a little 5 minutes over when I said I would finish, but we have at least 15, 20 minutes for questions. And I'm hoping that more than just Sergey are brave enough to ask me a question. So hopefully, one of you, yes?
Do you find that you get a lot of repeat bug reporters? Are there people who report bug after bug after bug?
So it depends on their experience with dealing with the company. I did a little audit inside of Microsoft and was finding that a majority of the bug reporters, like 70% of them, looked like they were one-hit wonders. That is not possible, statistically unlikely. So there were numerous reasons why that could be. If their name appeared in a bulletin, it's sort of an advertising for a skill set, right? A lot of hackers, the reason why that particular incentive worked for so long was because it translated into business opportunities. Consulting companies would make their reputations by pointing and racking up all of these bulletin credits, right? So some of them will drop off, because they got other gainful employment. Some of them will come back, repeatedly, and it honestly will depend on how good or bad the experience is with a particular vendor.
Were there ever cases of inside jobs where somebody purposely put a bug in and then shared the bounty?
So a lot of people were concerned about that with the $100,000, mitigation bypass bounty. Neato thing about that is that new mitigation bypasses were coming in at the rate of once every 3 years or so. After that program was created, Microsoft was getting them in. I think they paid it out in the last, less than 2 years of those bounty programs running. They've paid it out at least 5 times, so definitely increased the rate. Now, to your question about whether or not it was possible for collusion to happen, certainly it's always possible. However, the people with the skills to do that, Microsoft pays them so well that they would be giving up so much more in salary and benefits in order to trade for potentially 1, maybe 2. But it would be pretty difficult for them to pull off. And at the end of the day, Microsoft wanted to find out about those mitigation bypasses. This is also why there's no NDA, no intellectual property transfer, just a license agreement. And a person could quit today, submit to the bounty tomorrow. So the reason being that these are so valuable and they're needed so much that the risk of that happening was worth it. Yeah, you should have seen the lawyers when I said no NDA. They said no NDA what? But I didn't want to discourage anyone from coming forward.
What would be, well, I don't want to say black market, but the offense market?
Governments, primarily governments. Also some organized crime, but really.
So what would the bypass fetch?
They don't need the bypasses. They need the ODAs and the exploits. And what they will typically buy are things that they can't necessarily have enough people in-house who have the skills or the capacity to churn them out. So hate to pick on my friends at other companies, but there's certain software, maybe a reader, maybe a flash. Anyway, some kind of software where bugs can fall out a lot easier and exploits are a little bit easier to come by. So you would have sort of in-house folks doing that work, whereas very hardened versions of latest, PowerPoint, for example. PowerPoint has had significant hardening work done to its code base. Those will be something that they have to actually outsource and buy. So it won't necessarily be a bypass, but it will be stuff that they can't in-house source. Now, you know that governments don't pay as well as private industries. And actually a lot of the big hackers, big names today, Charlie Miller, you know that guy, Jeep hacking guy, car hacking guy, he was former NSA. The guy that I wrote the very first literal giant check of $100,000 was named James Forshaw, and he was former British intelligence, long time ago before he became a consultant. So literally James and the giant check. So he asked for the thing anyway. But yeah, a lot of the folks who are doing that bug hunting and exploit writing in-house for the governments, they will eventually tire of their government grade pay and know that their skills are valuable, and they will take them out into private industry. And so then you're faced with another outsourcing situation. Yep.
I'm curious about the timing, since there isn't an NDA, someone can post the exploit to exploit.db online, and then it finds its way into an exploit tool like Metasploit. So what's the timing between it's in Metasploit to actually getting the patch done? And is there a lot of attacks that occur in that space?
Well, put it this way. Before Microsoft was paying money, they just had that wink and a handshake. Please don't disclose this before we've patched it. So they were basically still operating with that, open communication, trying to make sure that the release is coordinated. Now, to give you an example of one of those mitigation bypasses that ended up getting posted, there's actually two stories about it. One, it could not be paid out. The other, it was paid out. The first one was when I was still working there. And we have restrictions as a US-based company. We cannot pay people in places where we've got economic embargoes, like Cuba, Syria, et cetera. So the first set of questions when something comes in for this bounty program was, are you over a certain age, over the age of 14 actually, because of child labor and all that stuff. I know, so much labor for $100,000, that poor child. Anyway, but over the age of 14, do you reside in one of the following countries, et cetera. So this hacker had come in, he said, yeah, I live in Syria, and I want to give you a mitigation bypass bounty. And we said, sorry, my friend, we actually can't pay you, but thank you anyway, and good luck. And so he said, okay, that's cool. Well, here it is anyway. So he gave it to us anyway. The next day he posted it on Pastebin, but he gave it to Microsoft, which is not something he needed to do. He wasn't going to get paid. So that's one story. Then there's another one of somebody who did get paid, and that was the Zero Day Initiative. Some of their researchers had found not just a new mitigation bypass, but there's actually a defense bonus associated with that. If you come up with a viable defense idea that could actually block the new attack technique, then you get a bonus. So they earned a partial bonus for their mitigation bypass defense. So in total, they took $125,000. And they worked with Microsoft. And what happened was they actually ended up writing this very extensive and sensitive blog post about their decision to go public. And the reason was that Microsoft had fixed some of the issues, but since they're deep architectural level issues, and ZDI knew this, it wasn't a matter of they're not fixing it fast enough. ZDI knew it was going to take several versions of Windows to fully address these issues. It just wasn't in the roadmap to fix it, not in the next version, not in the version after that. And so with that knowledge, basically, ZDI followed its own, published ethical compass about protecting its own users and notifying them that, by the way, here's the thing. And they wrote this very thoughtful blog post. Now, what's interesting about this is a very incestuous, security community. The person who wrote the blog post was a former case manager at Microsoft, so knew exactly, how to communicate, how to ease the pain, and be very transparent about the coordination. When I wrote Microsoft's, what became their coordinated vulnerability disclosure policy, my original draft actually had something in it that was cut by, I don't know, marketing or something. But the original draft said, even if you disagree on a disclosure timeline and we just can't agree, we would still like to coordinate with you so that at least the messages are the same. So anyway, how do you deal with that? You just deal with it, and as gracefully as possible. And ideally, the vendor is always acting as gracefully as possible, thanking the researchers for their work, even if the disclosure didn't quite go their way. It never really pays for a vendor to basically go after a researcher. It's a bad idea. Anyway, other questions? No, okay, well, maybe you're shy and maybe you'll come up to me afterwards, but thank you so much. This has been a pleasure. This is my first guest lecture, so thank you for being my first ones, and I appreciate it.